So I'm going to say to everyone here, hello and welcome. This is From Business to Buttons Design Lunch with Andy Budd. My name is David de Léon. I am a design director at inUse, and I will also be your host for the coming hour or so. Andy, as you will know, otherwise it's very strange of you to be here, will be one of the speakers at From Business to Buttons. And we are not going to dig into that topic today because we're going to save that for the conference. But the topic of your talk will be about why so many designers are kind of experiencing a type of midlife crisis and ennui, despite being so sought after. And a lot of us are finally getting a seat at the tables. That's an intriguing talk in itself. As Andy and I discuss, we'll have a relaxed conversation, maybe not about betting and such things and email, but as we speak, you will undoubtedly have questions for Andy. And so just post them in the chat, and my colleague Sarah Doltz will help me sort those through because my multitasking capacity is quite limited. So please welcome Andy Budd. Hi Andy, good to see you again. Glad that our computers are still working. I took a look at your Twitter profile earlier. Mm-hmm. First of all, I noticed that you tweeted like 69,400 times.
Yes.
I think I'm going to have to ask about that. That's about 69,398 more times than I tweeted. But looking at your profile, it says something like you're a design founder, you're a speaker, you're a startup advisor and a coach. And it also says that you are a trainee pilot and an ex-shark wrangler. So for those of us who are meeting you for the first time, could you help us unpack that rather alluring profile?
Sure thing. Well, I'll start with the sort of the elephant or the shark in the room, I guess, and sort of explain that background. So I love traveling. I love exploring new places. After university, when I was in my early sort of late teens, early 20s, I spent a lot of time traveling in Southeast Asia. And I discovered scuba diving, and I became a dive master and then a dive instructor on islands like Koh Tao and Koh Phi Phi and Koh Phangan. A lot of kind of Nordic, kind of Swedish, particularly people out there at the time working in dive shops. So I've built a strong affinity and a lot of sort of good friends who sort of come from Sweden. And actually, I'm looking forward to kind of catching up with some of my old diving chums from Thailand when I come over to speak at Business to Buttons. But yeah, I ended up becoming a dive instructor, and I traveled around the world for a number of years. And one of the jobs that I had was as on a liveaboard boat in the Barrier Reef. And we would go out into the Barrier Reef and we would organize shark dives. And so somebody would hop on a tender and have a little shot line with loads of fish heads. They'd drop it in the water and all the sharks would come. And my job was basically to be sitting between the sharks and the customers. And if the sharks got a little bit too close, you'd kind of give them a little nudge or a little push and get them out of the way. And what you learned in that role was to sort of spot shark attack behavior. So if you started seeing the sharks started to get a little bit aggressive, or typically they would arch their back and point their fins down, that's a territorial behavior that says you're in my space, get out. And sharks typically attack from below. So you're meant to kind of descend, so you can't be attacked from below. They typically attack from behind. So you kind of maneuver your body back to like a reef or a bomb or what have you. And then you just sort of let the sharks kind of go off and do their thing. And yeah, so, one of my many jobs was basically being a shark safety diver. But there was a terrible movie called Deep Blue Sea back in the sort of the 90s and noughties. And one of the characters had the title of Shark Wrangler. And I thought it was just kind of funny. Technically, I was a shark safety diver, but I just thought Shark Wrangler had a slightly nicer sound.
I think you're dismissing that movie a bit too quickly, but I think that's a separate conversation. Wow. An immediate follow-up question is, I can imagine being a shark wrangler, but how would one become one? It sounds like a very perilous journey.
Well, like I say, I was a dive instructor, and so I was mostly teaching people to dive, and I was a dive leader, so I take people on dive trips, and I just happened to be working on a dive boat that was in an area where they used to do shark feeding, and so being partly responsible for the safety of the divers was just one of the responsibilities on that boat. I would also get up in the morning and cook breakfast, and I would, do lots of other kind of unrelated kind of things. It's just that the shark kind of safety stuff was probably the most exciting and dramatic of the things I used to do as a dive instructor. But I've dived on active underwater volcanoes. I've done cave diving, exploring the underwater kind of cave systems of the Yucatan in Mexico. I've done a lot of wreck diving. I love kind of doing underwater things, and shark diving was one of them.
And then one day in the deep, you thought, hey, I should found a design agency. How do you go from there?
It's not a million miles away, and they actually were related. I kind of left university. I studied aeronautical engineering at university, which might also explain why I'm learning to fly at the moment. But I realized that I didn't want to kind of work in the aeronautical engineering space. I'd always been interested in computers. I was the kid in my class that sort of got the first computer in the neighborhood. While everyone's running around outside playing football, I was sort of in programming and playing snake games on my BBC computer. So I always had an affinity to technology. When I went traveling, I kind of was in a bit of a transitional space. I didn't want to be in engineering. I didn't know what I wanted to do. And I discovered the internet while I was traveling, and I would often research new destinations and find dive schools. It's like, oh, I'm in Indonesia at the moment. I want to go and get a job in Australia. So you research dive schools, you email them, et cetera. And two things happened. So one thing, I was sat in an internet cafe in Indonesia, in Sulawesi. And I was sat kind of doing my Hotmail, and the person next to me had a black screen with loads of like angle brackets. I was like, what is that person doing? That's not Hotmail. And when they got up to leave, I kind of sort of brought up the kind of, the sort of nerve to say, well, excuse me, what you were doing there? And this was like maybe 93, 94. And he's like, well, actually, I'm building my own webpage. And when I travel, I take photos and I post them onto the internet, and I don't have to email people. I can build this website page. And I was like, wow, I didn't even know you could like build web pages. I thought it was something that big companies did. So I was like, wow, I've got to learn how to do this. So when I travel, I can build my own webpage. And then I also happened to be in a hostel in Singapore, maybe a few months later, and I was chatting to this guy, an English guy, and I was like, what did you do for a living in the UK? And he's like, I'm a web designer. It's like, wow, what's that? And he's like, well, you do this thing called HTML. It's really easy. Any idiot can do it. And you get paid a ton of money. And I work for 6 months of the year, and I travel for 6 months of the year. And I was like, I like the sound of that. I'm an idiot. I could probably do this. I want to get paid good money, and I want to travel. And so after my travels, I came home, I bought a little kind of Pentium, like 486 computer. I sat in the bookshops at Borders and Waterstones, like nursing a cup of tea for a whole day, reading kind of books on Kai's power tools and the lynda.com books and, CSS for dummies and what have you. And I taught myself to be a designer. I initially started really as a web designer, doing everything from HTML, frame-based design and kind of PHP and coding. I also got into Flash. I was early Flash programmer. I made a lot of kind of object-oriented games in Flash. And then I discovered web standards, and it was sort of the web standards thing that kind of got me hooked into my career. I wrote, I think, maybe the third ever CSS book called CSS Mastery, which got really, really popular. I had the third ever CSS site in the UK. And so CSS and web standards became my thing for a while. But really, the thing that drew me was user-centered design. It wasn't sort of the front-end manifestation. It was trying to have a scientific approach to design, trying to understand user needs, and trying to build products and services that were not just pretty graphics, but actually had some utility and background. And so that's why when we started our agency, Clearleft, rather than being a web standards agency, we ended up becoming the first UX agency in the UK.
You say, and I heard you say this before, a scientific approach to design. What do you mean by that? And why do you use those terms?
Well, okay, so one of my favorite authors from the early days, and a really good friend of mine, is a guy called Jeff Veen. Jeff Veen was one of the founders of Adaptive Path, along with people like Jesse James Garrett and Peter Merholtz. And Jeff wrote an early book called The Art and Science of Web Design. Back in the day, web design was really a kind of a graphic design practice. So somebody would say, we need a website, and you would go, okay, and you'd make a pretty looking thing that met the brief of the client. And I always thought that felt a little bit shallow, because we weren't thinking about what the customer needed to achieve on the website. We weren't thinking about how their mental model related to the mental model that we had of the navigation and what the product did. We weren't really thinking about what the content was. We were often just designing a framework for the content. At the time, I didn't know anybody else that was doing user research. People would just kind of like open up Photoshop, design a thing, code it, launch it, and hope it worked. And I was like, well, let's make a prototype. Let's test that on people. Let's create some sitemaps to make sure that the information architecture works. Like, let's make, let's do good IA and think about the names of the sections that we had, and not just relate them to the business units of the company. All the sort of the basic stuff that, in sort of 97, 98, 99 was really, really unusual. But, give it 10 years and you start looking at the mid-noughties, had become the sort of dominant practice. And so it was looking at design from a more considered perspective, and looking at it as a set of problems to solve. And again, I think, these days, the idea that design is a process for problem solving is not contentious at all, at least amongst other designers. But at the time, people didn't think of design as a problem solving problem. Most people thought of design as an aesthetic problem and an arranging space problem. And I think the rise of UX and design thinking has really kind of elevated design. If you're aware of Buchanan's like 4 orders of design, I think most people still to this day that are outside the design industry see the first layer, just the kind of graphic design layer. But I've always been interested in the behavior layer, and seeing design as a problem solving and system creating kind of process.
So you're at Clearleft, you're doing this stuff, you're kind of discovering it. Seems like you're very early on using these practices. And then now you're advising other people, you're coaching leaders, so you're helping others. How did you move from being very hands-on and design-oriented towards stepping up a level and helping other designers?
Well, I mean, I think there's a bunch of things going on. I think there are fundamentally 2 models that you can have as a leader. And I think traditionally, a lot of leaders kind of position themselves at the top of a pyramid. The leader is the person who is good at all the things that the people do below them. Like, they're the sort of creative director, the sort of the black turtleneck wearing genius. And a lot of designers design their whole life and their whole company in order to service their ego. So they hire people who are less good at them, so they can train them up and they can teach them, but they can also be sort of like guru-like figures that everyone else kind of bows down to. Wow, this leader is amazing. I always hated that kind of creative genius approach to leadership. I've always seen that leadership should be a way of sustaining and supporting other people. So my approach has always been to hire people who are better than me. And if you consistently hire people who are better than you and then support them, that means you have an amazing company, but it also means generally you're the stupidest person in the team. You know the least, you have the least experience and talent, everybody, because you surround yourself by people who are better. And so there's a natural kind of outcome of that. Like, I could have decided to carry on doing design and kind of owned it, but really I wanted to build a company that had impact that was bigger than me. I didn't want to be the bottleneck. And so as you mature in your career, particularly if you become a design leader, you start really to be an implementer, a coordinator, a culture builder. You start to kind of pull people together and surround yourself by smart people. And so at some stage you get to the point where you realize, hey, look, like, there's no point in me doing the design work, because I've got a team of people around me who are just much, much better. And so your job is to kind of, people talk about providing air cover, creating culture, all of that kind of stuff. And so that's sort of how I went from being a practicing designer to being somebody that maybe worked a little bit more kind of behind the scenes, supporting other designers. But one of the things that's always driven me is this underlying belief that design is a huge opportunity that most of the rest of the world is not taking advantage of. I think design has the opportunity to make people's lives better. I'm not talking necessarily in kind of big IDEO kind of like, getting vaccines to the third world kind of design, although I think that is also true. But actually, like, a lot of everyday experiences are frustrating. Going and buying train tickets, going and interacting, with, online services, any time that you interact with technology, there's often a level of frustration. And that frustration often comes from a lack of understanding of the people who are using the technology and a lack of thinking through what those people need. And so that creates a gap, that creates an opportunity. And actually, I would strongly believe that great design is a value add to businesses. I think if you invest in design, you're solving business problems, you're creating kind of defensible moats that mean that you have a huge amount of value, which is really difficult for other people to kind of copy and steal. So I've long held this belief that design is a form of competitive advantages that companies need to be taking more opportunity of. However, I think we can all agree, if we're designers, we often find that design is not necessarily considered first. It's often not considered at all. Often it's a final thought. Often decisions get made over here in the boardrooms and meeting rooms and the BAs and the PMs. Some result gets decided and then it gets handed to design to implement. So there's this real challenge that designers still to this day are implementers. So one of the things that always drives me is to try and close that gap, to get better design in the hands of customers and to help designers get better at getting better design in the hands of customers. So in terms of the getting better design in the hands of customers, I did that through my agency work. We work with lots of amazing brands, high street brands, UK brands, Virgin Atlantic, kind of, British Gas, big American brands like, Mozilla, et cetera. And so that was our ability to try and close that gap and provide better design in the world. But as an agency, you can maybe only service 20, 30 companies a year. So if I wanted to get even more great design in the world, then my best opportunity was to help other people also see that. And so we started doing lots of conferences. I started organizing conferences. I think I've organized about 50 conferences in my lifetime, all over the world, in the UK mostly, but in other places. And I've spoken at hundreds and hundreds of conferences. And the goal there is to try and inspire designers to unlock their innate talent, to really show and demonstrate how useful and valuable design can be in order to impact customers' lives, and in doing so, impacting the financial fortunes of the people we work with. And so, the conference side of things was a big part of that. Also, through the conferencing, I used to run retreats, and I used to, and I still do actually do a lot of design coaching. So a lot of design leaders, because of some of the conferences I've organized, the Leading Design Conference, and I run a leading design community of 2,000 or 3,000 heads, directors, and VPs of design. And I used to take design leaders on retreats for a week to help them kind of be more strategic in their thinking. And so people started reaching out to me and saying, Andy, look, I'm a new design leader. I'm like maybe 3 or 4 years in the role. I'm wanting to have more impact in my work. I'm wanting to raise the profile of design. I'm wanting to help unlock the power of design. Can you help me? And so the last sort of like 18 months or so, I've been doing a lot of coaching, helping, younger design leaders become more impactful in their work. And one of the things I realized is that actually a lot of these design leaders work in organizations where the culture is already set, and it's already been set for a really long time. And what they're trying to do is they're trying to change the dominant culture. They're trying to change the view of design. Often design is, a second or third thought. It's product management, it's engineering, it's marketing, it's sales that are driving the conversation. And so a lot of these people find themselves in under mature organizations that don't appreciate design, and they're trying to change a big moving ship very, very slowly. And look, that's great. And I want to support those senior designers that are trying to slowly maneuver very, very large organizations into taking the advantage of design and user-centered design. However, I came to the realization that actually a more effective lever is not to try and change really, really big companies when the culture's set, but trying to get in at the start. And so I've recently moved into the venture space. I'm now technically a designer who's become a venture capitalist. I work for a company called Camp, and I help them invest in new up and coming businesses. And obviously one of my interests is trying to invest in more early stage startups that have design baked at the core. But also one of my goals as an advisor of startups, both through CCAMP and independently through just my outside interests, is to try and help bake a culture of design and understanding and appreciation of design at the start. Because if you can work one-on-one with that founder, if you can help that founder hire their first designer, and that first designer helps them solve all the problems they've been tussling with, what features should I have? What users should I talk to? What problems should I solve? How should I go out and talk to these customers? How should I address this market? All of these business problems are problems that designers can solve. And businesses often don't understand and realize that. So when you pair a business person up with an early stage designer, suddenly this magic happens. And when that happens, you have a business that has design at its core. And that means that like when other designers come on board, they're already joining a culture that kind of gets it. And so, like I say, I think where I'm focusing at the moment, where I think I can find the most leverage is to try and help those early companies become design centric before they get into too many kind of bad habits that then take a lot longer to kind of change and repair.
I imagine, that sounds like a beautiful place to be. I imagine that most of us participating in this Zoom meeting, we're probably not there. Maybe some of you are, and congratulations, but most of us are with these design leaders that you meet they're in a company that they need to, where they want to have more impact, and that there's already an ingrained culture. So when you coach those design leaders, what are some typical problems that they have, and what are the most common pieces of advice that you give them?
Well, that's a really good question. I will answer that, but I'd like to park that for a second, because there was something you said in the run up to that, which I'd like to just maybe dismiss, because you're sort of saying like, it's all very well that you can be in these early stage companies, but most people can't and aren't. And I want to try and change that, because every day I meet amazing founders with brilliant ideas that really, really care about design, but they are struggling to find designers who want to join early stage companies. And so what I'm trying to do fundamentally is to get designers to think, well, hold on, I could go and join this big established company, but it's going to be a potential uphill struggle. If I go and work at an early stage startup, I'm working directly with the founder. I'm building up a really, really strong relationship. So my ability to leverage and influence is so much better than being a design leader who reports to a head of product, that reports to a VP of product, that reports to the founder. Like, your ability to leverage that relationship is so much lower than if you become like the founding designer. Also, one of the great things about becoming the first designer in a company that maybe only 3 or 4 people, not only do you have that leverage and power, but you will probably own a significant proportion of the company. What you typically find is because startups can't maybe offer the same amount of money as a Google or a Facebook, they will remunerate you in equity. So not only are you an influential designer that has high status, but you might own a few % of this business. And if you're an owner of the business, you have much more impact. I think there are reasons why designers don't take these roles. And I think this, again, is something I think is really important to kind of change and look into. I think mistakenly, a lot of designers feel there's a high level of risk going and joining an early stage startup, because what if the founder doesn't get design? And they get drawn to going and working in companies that already have existing design teams. Like, the way that I can make sure that I go and work in a company that gets design is I can work at a company that has an existing design team. And I meet the designers and they're all lovely. And I meet the design leader, and they tell me this great story about how they're trying to make change. And I can work amongst a group of peers and I feel safe. However, time and time again, when I see people joining those teams, they don't realize how much of an uphill struggle it often is to get design heard. They can work in this little safe team of 4 or 5 designers, but as soon as they start talking to product, as soon as they start talking to marketing, as soon as they start talking to other people, they're kind of sort of pushed down and pushed back in their place. And you don't get that if you're the first designer through the door in a startup. You are maybe not equal to the CEO, but you're very, very influential. The other thing that's really great about joining a startup is that as the company grows, your career opportunities grow with it. So I've seen some amazing designers who have joined a startup, as their first role or their second role. And then 3 years later, they're leading a team of 5 people. And then 3 years later, they're leading a team of 50 people with 5 design leaders under them. And then 3 or 4 years later, they're the chief design officer or the VP of design, and they're having massive strategic impact on companies that are worth millions and millions of dollars. Because what happens is if you join an early stage startup and the startup grows, you grow with it. What I tend to find is if you join an existing company, the other elements of the company tends to grow faster than design, because engineering outnumbers design often 10 to 1. Marketing outnumbers design in terms of power. So what happens weirdly is even though you might be able to grow your impact in an existing company, other parts of the company are growing much faster than you, and the impact is growing much faster. So the delta actually increases rather than decreases. And so again, like my hope is that more designers will see joining early stage startups as a viable option. The other thing, just talking about the ownership, and then I'll answer your other question, which is like, I've been working in this industry for a really long time now. This is not a reason why you should join startups or make career choices, but the vast majority of people who I know who are now very, very wealthy are engineers and product people who joined early stage startups and those startups exploded. And I still see day after day amazingly talented designers who are stuck because all they're doing is they're selling their time per the hour. And they might get a decent salary, but they don't have that opportunity to have that life-changing experience because they're valuing themselves just on a per hour basis. Whereas if you invest in a company, or if you are the early founder in a company, as that company values grows and as you contribute to that value, your individual value grows as well. And I think that's the best way that designers can demonstrate value, and more importantly, get something back from the value they deliver, because they have a stake in that value creation. If you don't have a stake in the value creation, then your ability to benefit from the value you deliver is massively diminished.
That's great, but then there are also, and it's great to be corrected. I have 2 follow-up questions. One is, if I'm a junior designer, is it a good training ground to go to a startup? And also remember that there are a lot of designers who may be primarily not motivated by money or a career, but maybe want to work in the public sector and to contribute to society in that kind of way. So what advice would you give the junior or the value-driven designer?
I mean, there's a bunch of good answers there. Like, absolutely. So first of all, I think there are lots of startups out there that are doing some form of social good. And so there are startups out there who are investing in clean tech, who are investing in health, who are trying to remove inequality. They're trying to build opportunities for people who haven't had opportunities. And so I don't think it's safe to say that, all startups are motivated purely by money. In fact, actually what you tend to find, I think, is a lot of startups come from an idealistic space. And they're wanting to kind of make some kind of fundamental change in the world. And I actually think to some extent you could argue that your ability to impact the world is probably a lot higher if you're working in an early stage startup that has a level of flexibility than you are one of 100 designers in a government department. You are both doing good things, but your ability to influence and your ability to make that impact can be higher. I also think there are a lot of sort of startup founders that are libertarian and use the value thing as a way of getting designers in to do stuff, and then they realize that maybe there's been a beta switch going on there. So I think you need to be conscious about the companies that you work for and the values that you have. In terms of like whether there is a space for younger designers in startups, I mean, it's a difficult question to ask or answer, because actually I think just being a younger designer is really, really challenging in general. If you look at most jobs, whether it's a startup or an existing company, most people want a designer with 3 or 4 years experience. And often when you join a company, there's an expectation, if you're a younger designer, that you're going to get mentored, you're going to get coached. And if I join a larger team, I'll get mentored and get coached. But often if you're joining a really, really big company, what they're actually looking for you to do is to slot in to a conveyor belt type system. And so I see a lot of younger designers going into companies expected to get a much wider range of experience when in fact they're kind of, they're responsible for a very, very small part of an already really existing system. They've been given a design system. They're basically assembling new blocks of functionality out of the design system. And what they're going to be doing in a year's time looks very, very similar to what they're going to be doing now. So actually, I tend to find that your ability to grow your design capability often gets stuck a little bit when you join bigger companies, because you're working on the same project for 3-4 years. I remember talking to a designer at a big tech company who spent 9 months redesigning an icon. And every month he would redesign the icon, and then he'd spend 2 months pitching this new icon to existing stakeholders. It would all come back with changes. And literally 9 months, he'd done thousands and thousands of revisions. And he loved doing icon design, but at the end he had to leave because I have nothing to show for the 9 months I've been at this company apart from this icon. I remember sort of talking to the head of design for Google homepage, and he was a head of design for Google homepage, except for the Google Doodle. So basically the search box, and he had like 20 designers working for him. And you're like, as a designer, as a junior designer on a team where your entire focus is basically a text box and what happens when you start typing that text box, like what is your opportunity to spread your wings and explore a whole diverse range of learning opportunities? It's really limited. If you jump to an agency, and I'm a big fan of agencies, I think agencies are sort of the mangrove forest of the design world. As a young designer, you go and join an agency and you will cycle through in 2 or 3 years 10 or 20 different projects, big and small. You'll get used to starting things from scratch, 0 to 1. You'll start optimizing things. One day you might be working in a big utilities company or a huge charity, or another time you might be working in a young startup. So I think if you're a younger designer, getting that opportunity in the agency world is good. But I also think there are big opportunities in startups. One of the sad things is a lot of mid-level designers choose to avoid startups. And so actually a lot of startups end up hiring younger designers. And those younger designers are expected to take the company from 0 to 1. Often they don't have the experience, they don't have the support network. So they're kind of learning on the job. But again, if I look at a designer that their first job was a startup or an agency, a year later versus a designer that's joined a big company as a big part of a big team, they're leaps ahead in terms of their experience, because they've had their finger in everything. They've been involved in every single conversation. They've been doing usability testing. They've been doing research. They've been doing prototyping. They've been coming up with new ideas and new features. And their portfolio is so much richer than, I speak to people that have been in big companies for 3 or 4 years, and they're almost embarrassed about what's in their portfolio, because it's like, well, it doesn't really look like I've been doing an awful lot. So yeah, I think that would be sort of one response to your question, your provocation, I think.
Lovely. So do lots of things and do more than one icon a year, a variety of things. I think one reason I asked is we do a lot of recruiting. And so I meet a lot of people who come from agencies. I meet a lot of people who come directly from school. I meet people who've been at companies. And I just find that and this is generalizing, horribly generalizing, but I find that people who've maybe been at a big company or even a startup, and they've been the only designer, that they're less able sometimes to articulate design decisions. I just noticed that they've had fewer design conversations with designers. And they might be very good at the craft, and they're good at collaborating with maybe a team of developers, but they sometimes just lack the storytelling capability of arguing for their design and talking about rationales, or founding it in good user insights. And it's a horrible generalization, but that's just something I think, tend to have spotted.
No, I think you're right. I think there's an interesting thing that's sort of underlying that. The reason that designers in large organizations get really good at having to articulate their design is because people don't believe in what they're doing. And people don't invest in what they're doing. And so every meeting is a high-risk meeting, because the thing you've been working on might not go over the line unless you get really, really good at convincing stakeholders don't care what you're doing, that they should care. So you're absolutely right. You get really good at politics. You get really good at articulating design if you're in an environment where design is not valued as much. Your design skills stop being about the craft skills. They stop being about solving problems. You solve the problem, that's the easy thing. In a large organization, like you spend a week solving a problem, then you spend 2 months convincing people that that's the right problem. Going back to my icon designer friend, like they spent a week doing, the design icon, and then they spent 2 months going on a roadshow trying to tell the story of the icon and get everybody on board. And all you need is one person to go, I don't like it, and you go back to the drawing board. The reason that I think a lot of younger designers don't have that skill in early stage startups and maybe agencies as well is because the people they're working with have already bought in. They're not having to convince people why. They're not having to necessarily overly analyze their decision-making process, because that decision-making process isn't going to get ripped to shreds. The startups want to move really quickly. And, usually what happens is, you go away, you do a thing, you come back, you tell the founder, they're like, that's great. And if you're constantly in a permissive society or in a permissive, sort of relationship with your bosses, you might feel a little bit let down. It's like, oh, I really want my boss to tell me that was rubbish and to have me explain why, fight to kind of increase my communication skills. But they just keep saying I'm doing really good work and to carry on. So yeah, maybe there's not as much opportunity to learn, but what there is an opportunity is to have, and also those things, those conversations in an early stage startup often are just a conversation on Slack or like a 10-minute call with the founder. They're not like, well, I've got to go away and put a deck together and I've got to present that deck to 5 different people. Like, I remember working for one client, a big publishing client, where we had to get 60 stakeholders on board to agree to one decision. That unfortunately is the design role of a lot of designers and design leaders. It's trying to get 60 people to agree on one thing. And that's a really, really great skill if you want to work in that area. The good thing about, weirdly, I think, being a designer in a startup is that will come, but it comes as the company grows. As the company grows and they hire their first marketing person, then you need to learn how to negotiate with marketing, and you need to understand what your boundaries are. And then they hire a salesperson. You need to learn how to understand your boundaries there. And so as a young designer, as you grow, you're learning these new skills as they sort of flow in. If you're a young designer where you're thrown into an environment where you've already got a head of sales that's got 20 salespeople that's turning over, driving 100 million sales a month, and you're just the design junior that's coming in and says, oh, I don't really like what you're doing with this landing page. What ability are you going to have to override this kind of like, sales director, earning 500,000 pounds a year? So I think early stage startups can be a really, really nice kind of training space, because like I say, you grow as the company grows, and the skills that you grow are accreted slowly rather than being thrown in the midst of this often challenging political psychodrama that a lot of us find ourselves in.
Lovely. So I'm leaving inUse for a startup. No, I think you make some really good points, and I really enjoyed it. Let's back up to a previous question, which was, okay, we're not at a startup. We are a design leader somewhere else, and we're struggling to have more impact. And you coach a lot of design leaders in that kind of situation. What are some of the most common things that they struggle with, and some of your most common pieces of advice? Help us, Andy.
Well, look, it's tough. And again, I don't want to sort of over-index on the startup thing. I think there's a lot of amazing designers out there that are in really, really interesting companies that are trying to advance the practice of design. Like I say, I set up a community of about 3,000 heads, directors, and VPs of design. So I know the challenges these people face. And actually, the reason I started leading design was because I was having conversations with founders, and the same themes were coming up and over again. And rather than repeat myself, I thought, well, hey, let's run an event where people can come together and share. I think one of the biggest challenges, I think, for moving from a designer to being a leader is being able to switch your sphere of influence and switch your perspective on what you're doing in your role. I think you tend to sort of have this kind of journey where as a junior designer or a lead designer, they're very, very much focused on delivering great work. And that's their sort of primary focus. And often these people are the inheritors of strategy that come sort of further up the line. And they're like, they're told to build a thing and they go away and build it, but they're frustrated because they don't have influence over what they're building. So there's a natural tendency for designers to want to get into leadership because they believe that if I get into leadership, I will get more visibility of the decision-making process. And actually also, if I'm a leader of a team, I can remove some of the frustrations that I've experienced as a practitioner. So there's a real kind of generous kind of spirit of like, actually, I love doing design work, but if I move into this space, I can make designers like me who are coming after me, their lives better. So early stage designers often really focus on fixing those kind of tactical operational problems that they felt the pain of as a designer. And often their viewpoint or their mindset is my role as a design leader is to go to my bosses and get them to give me the resources and the power to fix all the problems my designers are telling me. My designers are telling me this is broken and I hate working with the product manager. I'm fed up with marketing telling me to do X, Y, Z, and I'm going to go and I'm going to solve all these problems. Very, very quickly, you realize that you can't solve all these problems because they're institutional problems. And actually, if you've gone and you've promised your design team that you can solve all these problems, they're going to feel let down. And actually, that's one of the biggest things that I see early stage designers have, or design leaders, is that they have sort of gone to bat and they become really combative because they're trying to sort of almost like a sort of a trades union foreman. They're trying to sort of bubble up the frustrations of the design team that are built up over many years. However, if you just go and fight and have this kind of combative approach, people will not only sort of, push you back, but they'll really quickly start to sort of figure out how we can work around the design team. So I've come across many, many situations where the designers are actually feeling ignored because the rest of the organization is going, well, this is a bit of a difficult group of people that are hard to please. We're going to ignore them. We're going to go straight to engineering. Every time I ask the design team to do X, they want to spin up a big research project. I make a joke on Twitter, like how many designers does it take to change a light bulb? Well, first we need to do a big research project to understand the role of light in society. Now, if you're the project manager that's like, no, I just need to change a light bulb because it's dark in here and I want to be able to read. And you have a bunch of designers saying, well, no, but in order to do this properly and to make us feel good, we need to go out and we need to explore what it's like to read under candlelight, under spotlight, under moonlight, in order to really, really sort of soak up, as a product manager, like, God, these designers are really frustrating. I'm just going to go to engineering and engineering will build me this thing. So like we need to stop being so irritating, I'm afraid. And we need to start seeing ourselves as partners. We are in service to our business partners. And so the next change happens, which is design leaders going, okay, actually, I'm in a business and maybe I need to figure out how design can contribute to the business and provide value. Now, the first stage of that, again, it's often a little bit egotistical. It's like, okay, what I need to do, I need to understand the value of business and the language of business so I can go and convince my bosses or my peers in marketing and design to do what I want them to do. Because I'm a designer, I know I'm right. I know that all the stuff I've been told is the right way to do things. And I know that marketing and engineering don't have a clue what they're doing. And I'm going to learn business because I'm going to teach them how stupid they've been. And if all I can do is get that magical set of words, I'll teach you the rest of the organization how stupid they've been, and I'll be the hero because design will rule the roost. And so we start to learn the language of design, but not because we want to understand business, because we want to use it to get our own way. And again, as you can understand, that invariably fails because it's like, well, who are these people coming here, trying to tell us what to do, so that becomes problematic. So then what typically happens is eventually those design leaders go, okay, maybe the best way to demonstrate that design can deliver value is to demonstrate that design can deliver value. Maybe we should go and ask the business, use our research hats on and go, oh, what happened if I ask the business what they need? And what if I said, oh, well, that's interesting. You need this. We can deliver that for you. You've got a problem around retention. My team can help fix that retention problem. You need to get more people finishing the sign-up process. Well, let's spin up a team to figure out how we can make that sign-up process as good as possible. You want to get more customers joining. Let's figure out how me and the design team can get people to invite their friends. So you need as a designer to start thinking, what are the goals of the business and how can design contribute to the goals of the business, rather than us telling the business, well, if we were in charge, this is what we do, and you're all idiots and you're doing it wrong. And what this means is there's this terminology which is called like your first team. And your first team is a team you serve. And I think as a leader of designers, there's this assumption that my first team are my designers, and every decision I make is in support of the designer's wishes. When you become an executive, not maybe sort of like lead level or head level, when you become a director or VP, your first team is a business. You are a business function that is trying to advance a set of business goals through the unique set of skills you have, which is design, users into design, understanding needs, and improving the product. And if you can help those other partners in your team, marketing, engineering, product, advance their agenda, they're going to be appreciative of you helping advance their agenda, and they're going to want to come back and hear more. And so again, I think the other problem is, like, we as designers, we often want to boil the ocean. We want to make the perfect product out the gate first time. And actually, when we don't make the perfect product out the gate first time, we get really sad and we get really disappointed. We go, oh, the industry doesn't, the bosses don't understand me. And like, I meet so many designers, I look at their work and go, this work is brilliant. Like, you've done an amazing job, but they're depressed because actually it could have been so much better if only that person listened to me. And so we need to see the products we build not in terms of like the project that we're working on, but as a long-term 3, 4, 5 year initiative, which we are advancing the quality, we are delivering results, we are slowly convincing our stakeholders that we have value. That unlocks more opportunities, that allows us to do more stuff, to deliver more value, and that's how we grow. And the product will be amazing. And it will be amazing, but it will be amazing in 3 or 4 years' time. And it's frustrating that we know that we can make it amazing overnight. But the reality of the environment we find ourselves in is like, you don't have the opportunity to do that, because you have to build that credibility, you have to build that relationships, And so a lot of the things you need to do as a design leader actually has very little to do with design. It's about, building and maintaining relationships, helping people out, making people look good, delivering value in interesting ways, knowing what battles are worth fighting and what battles are not worth fighting, and demonstrating value slowly, being a great partner. So that's one of the big challenges, is that mind shift of using business to try and convince people that your argument is right, into understanding the mechanics of business and understanding where design sits in and how design can be leveraged or used to advance the organizational goals, but doing it in a way that doesn't forget the needs of the user. And this is why I love designers. I think designers, one of the areas I'm really focused on or interested in is the area of design-led growth, because a lot of people that have been involved in growth before, marketers and growth hackers, have done growth in a way that delivers results for the business, but often tramples over the needs and the rights of the users as a result. And I think as a designer, that's a really bad outcome. So I want to see more designers being involved in that conversation, because if we can deliver the results for the business, but in a way that also respects and understands the needs of the consumers, not only have we created a short-term value gain, but we've created a massively long-term value gain. And so, but we need to be in that space where we're delivering the short-term value in order to demonstrate that the long-term value should be worth investing in. So yeah, that's sort of where I sit there, I think.
So I was, as you were talking, I was thinking, as a designer, it should be quite exciting with business goals, because you have something very concrete and it's measurable, and you can see, instead of being dissatisfied with only 8% of your design making it into the product, you should be satisfied with the actual impact. And yet I was thinking, how do I balance? You were saying designers are kind of well positioned to balance user needs and respect for users in all kinds of ways with the business goals. And I was just wondering, I'm trying to imagine what that would be like. What kind of person shifts easily between the demands of the business and the users and feels, and is able to balance those things? I imagine the balance is the hard thing. You would probably tip over to one or the other. What would you advise?
I mean, I think to be a really good designer in a corporate setting, you need to be quite pragmatic. And pragmatism is a difficult skill to kind of develop. And pragmatism basically means being able to create trade-offs and being comfortable with the trade-offs you're making. And I think if you're not pragmatic, then you can become quite intransient. I'm sorry, I'm losing my language this morning. I do apologize. You can be quite set in your ways and difficult to maneuver. And I think a lot of designers I meet have this sort of really, really firm belief that there's one way of doing things. And if they don't do everything at 100% of their ability and it's all right, then somehow they're failing. So you need that flexibility. The other thing is you need speed. So you need to be able to deploy things really quickly. A lot of designers, like I say, want to go off and do, lots of pre-work and lots of, research and think deeply about a problem. And that's understandable. And as the company grows and the risks grow, then you have the ability to do that. But being able to deploy things at speed, being really, really quick and really, really effective, and be able to demonstrate value, and then be able to come back and say, hey, we did this thing, we demonstrated value, but there's more value we could deliver if you give us a bit more time. And then, oh, that's great, we'll give you more time. And then you deploy even more value. You're like, but if you give us even more time, and so you're leveraging up. So pragmatism and speed, I think, are really important. I think. Remind me what the question was again. I think there was something else in there that
I like where you were going there. But as a designer, I was just thinking that if I'm looking at business goals and I'm looking at user needs and respecting users, that it's a hard thing to balance. I was trying to imagine the kind of person who can balance those things without tipping over into one or the other. And I was asking you for advice how to become that person.
I mean, I think some of it is around experience. Well, partly I think it's around. I think there's a tendency for groups to other groups, so designers often other engineering and marketing often others designers, engineers, etc., which I think is a really strange behavior, particularly from a group of people that are very, very much around understanding empathy. I think as designers, we are really, really quick to employ or deploy our empathy on user needs, but we're quite slow to deploy our empathy against our business partners. So I think one of the things we need to do is we need to start having conversations with our business partners to understand what their goals are, what their thinking is, and then we can use that knowledge to try and steer people in the right direction. I think if we go in on the attack, like we end up having kind of quite sort of blunt two-dimensional conversations. Whereas if we're a little bit more empathetic, we can understand, we understand that like as a marketing team, you've got these heavy KPIs to hit at the end of the year to deliver this growth. And so because of that, I understand why you're using this growth technique. However, here are 3 other growth techniques that we could use that might be as effective, but might not be raising this risk that we see. And so a lot of it becomes around, to your point earlier, if you're in a large organization, it becomes around negotiating skills. It comes around, to some extent, almost this idea of improvisation. I think saying yes, but if you're somebody that says, well, yeah, we could do that, but here's an even better idea. That's often a much more persuasive way than going, no, we disagree. Because I think you can say no and disagree if you're in a position of power. Like engineers are great at this. Engineers will say, no, we disagree using this stack and, or this feature because it's going to be hard to maintain, because it's going to be, whatever. And everyone's like, oh, well, we can't go around the engineers because we need them to build it. And so they have power. The problem with designers is we often don't have power. So when we say no, we often do it in a way that's not particularly convincing, and people go, well, if you're not going to do it, we're just going to get an external person to do it for us. And so while I think it's a superpower, and I think once you gain status in an organization, designers need to start saying no a lot more. I think designers also want to be helpful, and they say yes to a lot of things that aren't reasonable. But in the early stages, I think it becomes a yes and. It's like, yes, we can do that, but have you thought about X, Y, Z? The other thing, I mean, again, just in terms of ethics and morality and what have you, I think we are in a better state at the moment with the advancements of things like, the concept of dark patterns. Good friends with Harry Brignall, used to work at my agency Clearleft. He coined the term dark patterns. And I think there are a lot of behaviors that companies used to deploy, product managers and marketing people especially, that fall into the definition of dark patterns. And I think previous to that definition, it was often quite difficult for designers to convince marketing people and salespeople not to do this, because our competition is doing this, why shouldn't we do this? Mm-hmm. And we just wave our hands and go, oh, but it's not cool, it's not fair. Now we can say, well, look, actually that's a dark pattern, which already giving it a name, and giving it a name that sounds a bit scary is like, oh, okay, well, I didn't realize we were using dark patterns. Dark patterns don't sound like they'll be a good thing that we should use. We can also say, hey, look, you have a commitment to transparent design work and great user experience. This is not that. You can also say, hey, look, if it gets out that we use dark patterns, it could be a really bad PR disaster. And more importantly, you can say, well, hey, look, statutes like California have actually brought in legislation that are banning the use of dark patterns. I suspect that Europe will come, really, really quickly. If we follow this set of dark patterns, we might find ourselves in 6 months' time in a legal nightmare. So why don't we try and solve this problem, but solve a problem in a way that isn't going to have a big backlash? And actually, sort of going back to some of the stuff around kind of building consensus, like designers, we need to find other people in the organization that can back us up. So, if marketing is saying, hey, look, we really want you to do this, we want you to surreptitiously check a box that shouldn't be checked so we can spam people. You might not have the power to kind of go against head of marketing, but go and talk to the legal and compliance people and say, hey, look, what's your position on the company using dark patterns? I read this article about a new European legislation saying that dark patterns are going to be banned. And they go, oh, that's interesting. Let me look into that. And they'll be like, oh, no, we can't use dark patterns. And then you're like, oh, that's great. Could you go and tell marketing that we've got a new policy around not using dark patterns? And then suddenly you've got someone that has more power that's going, that's advancing your agenda. So yes, being able to negotiate and use propaganda and to protect the integrity of the user experience. But you can only do that if the thing that you deploy actually works. If you go, okay, well, we're not going to use this dark pattern, but we're going to do this other really, really interesting technique around leveraging the network effects of the platform, that's going to mean actually we're going to, this will be an even better way to grow customers. So we have to be able to have that growth conversation. We have to be able to find ways of helping people advance their agenda that works, that is in alignment with our values and the values of the customers we serve.
I think those were really great answers. I have about 16 follow-up questions, but we are at the end of our allotted time, which is a delightful kind of frustration to feel. I hope to get an opportunity to talk to you again then on the 13th of May, when it's our conference From Business to Buttons. I think Sarah said to advise us to look in the chat. Perhaps there will be some kind of a discount code or something else for those of you who haven't quite decided whether to go or not. But this time we know it's not online, it's going to be live. And yes, I can say nothing else, but Andy, thank you so much. You've given me a lot to think about. I'm going to probably have to look at this recording myself. And I'll come back to you on stage with some more questions. Thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure. And just one literally quick sort of final thing is a few people in the chat have been asking about your follow-up about bigger companies. And that really is the bulk of the talk that I'm giving at Business to Buttons. So, I skewed a little bit startup-y wise because I don't want to give away all of the amazing stuff that I'm talking about. But yeah, if you work in a big company, come along to the conference, you'll see the talk and hopefully it will all be clear.
Thank you for that plug, Andy. That was wonderful. And everyone else, thank you for joining us. I hope you got something out of this. I certainly did. And I suspect we will have more of these lunches. So take care, have a great week. And don't forget to cut and paste the discount code.